The warm evening air of Savannah carried the distant sound of horse-drawn carriages clattering along the cobblestone streets. The glow of antique street lamps flickered against the historic buildings, casting elongated shadows on the pavement. Oglethorpe's fine dining stood at the heart of the city, its reputation built on tradition, exclusivity, and an unspoken set of rules that had been upheld for decades. Tonight, those rules were about to be tested. Barron Trump stepped out of the sleek black SUV and adjusted the brim of his red MAGA hat. He didn't wear it for attention. He didn't wear it to provoke. It was simply a part of who he was. The soft glow of the restaurant's golden chandelier spilled out onto the sidewalk as he pulled open the heavy wooden door, stepping inside with an effortless confidence that immediately drew glances. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of seared steak, aged bourbon, and old money. Crystal glasses clinked against fine china, and murmured conversations filled the grand dining hall. Wealthy patrons, politicians, business elites, and Southern aristocrats were seated in plush leather booths, enjoying the exclusivity that Oglethorpe's promised. At first, no one reacted. A young hostess, barely in her 20s, greeted him with the polished warmth expected of the establishment. "Good evening, sir. Will you be dining alone tonight?" "Yes," Barron replied with a small nod. "Just a table for one." The hostess smiled, picking up a leather-bound menu. "Right this way." As Barron followed her deeper into the restaurant, whispers began to stir. A man at the bar nudged his wife. A group of businessmen exchanged glances. A waiter near the kitchen hesitated mid-step before continuing his way to a table. At the far end of the room, Jim Calloway, the restaurant's owner and manager, stood near the bar, watching the scene unfold. His jaw tightened. Oglethorpe's prided itself on maintaining a neutral atmosphere. No politics, no controversy, just fine dining. That hat, that unmistakable red, was about to disrupt the delicate balance he had spent years protecting. He exhaled slowly, setting down his glass. "I'll handle this," he muttered to a nearby server before walking toward Barron's table with measured steps. By the time Barron settled into his seat, he could already feel the shift in energy around him. He ignored the stares, the low murmurs of conversation shifting in his direction. He simply picked up the menu and began scanning for a meal he had ordered many times before. A shadow loomed over his table. "Excuse me, sir." Barron looked up, meeting the sharp, assessing gaze of Jim Calloway. The man was in his early 50s, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his tailored suit crisp. There was no hostility in his expression, but there was no warmth either. "We have a policy here," Jim continued, his voice firm but even. "No political apparel. I'm going to have to ask you to remove the hat." A hush fell over the nearby tables. Even the waitstaff had subtly paused their movements. Barron studied the man for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I wasn't aware of that policy," he said, keeping his voice neutral. Jim gestured toward the entrance. "It's an unspoken rule. We like to keep the dining experience here, free from outside distractions." Barron considered this, his fingers resting on the edge of the menu. He had been to restaurants before where glances were thrown his way, where the air changed when he entered. But never had he been asked, no, ordered, to remove something that was a part of him. A muscle in Jim's jaw twitched as the silence stretched between them. The weight of the moment pressed heavy against the polished mahogany table. "I'm not looking to make a scene," Barron said finally, his tone measured. "I just came for a meal." Jim remained firm. "And we're just looking to keep this establishment as it's always been. So I'll have to ask again. Please take it off, or we'll have to ask you to leave." The tension in the room thickened. Across the restaurant, Richard Carter, a real estate mogul and one of the restaurant's longtime patrons, leaned back in his chair, watching with mild amusement. At the bar, Hannah Calloway, Jim's 20-year-old daughter, had frozen, her fingers curled around a glass of water. The weight of decision hung heavy in the air. Barron knew he had two options. He could comply, remove the hat, and stay. But that wasn't who he was. The second option was clearer. With a small, almost imperceptible nod, Barron set the menu down and pushed back his chair. The scrape of wood against marble rang loudly in the silence. He stood, adjusting the brim of his cap, and glanced at Jim. "If that's how you feel," he said evenly, "then I'll leave." He didn't wait for a response. He turned, walking with the same quiet confidence he had entered with, his expression unreadable. The restaurant remained frozen in place as he passed by the other diners. Some watched with concealed intrigue, others with poorly hidden smirks. A few looked genuinely uncomfortable. Hannah watched him walk toward the door, something twisting inside her. As Barron reached the entrance, he hesitated for only a second before stepping out into the night. The heavy door closed behind him with a soft thud, sealing the moment inside Oglethorpe's like a chapter unfinished. Inside, the silence stretched for another beat before Richard Carter let out a quiet chuckle and took a sip of his bourbon. "Well," he mused, turning to Jim. "That was interesting." Jim said nothing. He simply turned back toward the bar, his grip tightening around his glass. At that same moment, Hannah quietly reached for her phone under the counter, her heart hammering as she typed out a short message. The world was about to hear about what had just happened. The night air outside Oglethorpe's was crisp, carrying the distant hum of Savannah's evening crowd. The warm glow from a restaurant's windows flickered behind Barron as he stepped onto the cobblestone street, adjusting the brim of his MAGA hat. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. But deep inside, a quiet storm stirred, not because of what had happened, but because of what it meant. Across the street, under the dim light of a vintage lamppost, a pair of eyes followed him. Hannah Calloway stood motionless, phone gripped tightly in her hands. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She had just witnessed something that didn't sit right with her, something that felt wrong. Inside the restaurant, the silence still lingered like smoke after a fire. Jim Calloway stood stiffly at the bar, his fingers curled around a half-empty glass of bourbon. He had done what he thought was right, protected the reputation of Oglethorpe's, upheld its unspoken rules. And yet, the uneasy knot in his stomach refused to loosen. Richard Carter let out a slow chuckle, swirling the ice in his drink. "Well, Jim," he mused, leaning back in his chair. "I hope that was worth it." Jim's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he exhaled sharply and turned toward the servers. "Back to work," he ordered, his voice edged with tension. The waitstaff hesitated for a fraction of a second before resuming their duties, though the energy in the room had undeniably shifted. Hannah hesitated outside, her fingers trembling as she unlocked her phone. The video was already queued up, a clean, clear shot of her father standing over Barron's table, delivering his ultimatum. The audio was crisp, every word sharp. The moment was real. Her thumb hovered over the screen. For years, she had admired her father's strength, his conviction. But tonight she had seen something different, a side of him she wasn't sure she recognized. A notification popped up on her screen, an unread message from her best friend, Tessa. "Tessa, tell me you didn't just watch that go down." Hannah swallowed hard, her thumb hesitating for only a second longer before pressing send. Within minutes, the video began spreading like wildfire. Barron walked with steady strides toward the square, his mind racing. He could already feel his phone vibrating in his pocket. Messages, notifications, something brewing. But he ignored it for now. He just needed a moment to think. He found an empty bench near the fountain, the water glistening under the soft glow of string lights. Exhaling slowly, he pulled out his phone, scanning the screen. 20 missed messages. A text from his mother. "Are you all right?" A message from a friend. "Dude, check Twitter." Now, Barron's lips pressed into a thin line. He tapped open his notifications and immediately saw it. The video. It had already been shared thousands of times. His face, his reaction, his quiet refusal to engage in an argument. And more than that, the comments. Some were supportive, calling him a class act. Others ridiculed him. But the conversation wasn't just about him. It was about what had happened. Barron took a slow breath, reading through the flood of opinions, debates, arguments. The restaurant's name was already trending. People were calling for boycotts. Others were defending the establishment's right to set its own rules. It had only been an hour since he walked out, and already the world had latched onto the moment. A new message flashed onto his screen. Unknown number. Hey, I don't know if you remember me, but we need to talk. He frowned slightly, tapping on the contact. The number wasn't saved, but the message felt oddly familiar. He hesitated before typing back. Barron, who is this? The response came instantly. Unknown number. Hannah Calloway. Barron exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around the phone. He glanced back toward the restaurant, where the glow of the windows still burned against the night. This was about to get interesting. Inside Oglethorpe's, Jim sat in his office, rubbing a hand over his face. His phone buzzed relentlessly against the mahogany desk, notifications lighting up the screen like wildfire. He ignored them, but then the office door creaked open, and Hannah stepped inside. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, arms crossed, phone still clutched in her hand. Jim sighed, leaning back in his chair. Go ahead, he muttered. Say whatever it is you came to say. Hannah's eyes burned into him. I didn't have to say anything, she replied, her voice low. Already did. Jim's gaze snapped to her, and for the first time that night, something in his chest tightened with real unease. His daughter wasn't just another critic. She was part of the storm. Barron sat on the edge of the fountain, staring at his phone. He had met a lot of people in his life, navigated a lot of situations. But this was different. He had no intention of turning this into a war. No interest in fueling the fire that was already spreading. But he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. The night air in Savannah felt heavier than usual, thick with the weight of something unspoken. The historic city, with its cobblestone streets and ghostly whispers of the past, had no idea that a storm was brewing. One that didn't come from the sky, but from a single moment inside Oglethorpe's fine dining. Barron sat on the worn stone bench in Forsyth Park, staring at his phone. The glow of the screen reflected off his face, illuminating the unread messages piling up faster than he could process. His name was everywhere. The video, Hannah's video, had gone viral. Not just a few thousand views viral. National attention viral. Twitter, Instagram, news outlets. Some praised him for his composure. Others mocked him. Some called it an attack on free speech. Others called it the restaurant's right to enforce its own policies. The debate was fierce, loud, and growing by the second. His phone buzzed again. Another message. Unknown number. I need to talk to you. Please. Hannah. Barron exhaled sharply, rubbing his thumb across the edge of the phone. He should ignore her. This wasn't his problem anymore. He had left, hadn't made a scene, hadn't fed into the outrage. But something about the message, about her, made him hesitate. He typed back, Barron, where? A few seconds later, the response came. Hannah, Forsyth Park, near the willow tree. Barron slipped his phone back into his pocket and stood. The city was quieter now, the streets dimly lit by antique lamps casting long shadows on the pavement. As he walked, the distant hum of laughter and conversation from late-night bars drifted through the air, mingling with the faint scent of jasmine and rain-soaked stone. The park was nearly empty, save for a lone figure sitting on the wooden bench beneath the old willow tree. Hannah. She looked up as he approached, her face barely illuminated by the glow of her phone screen. I wasn't sure you'd come, she admitted, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Barron kept his hands in his pockets. Neither was I. The air between them was thick with something unsaid. The weight of what had happened at Oglethorpe's. The weight of the storm she had set in motion. I didn't think it would get this big, she finally said, shaking her head. I mean, I knew people would react, but she gestured at her phone. My dad's getting threats. The restaurant's getting flooded with calls. Reporters are showing up. It's a mess. Barron studied her for a long moment. And what do you want me to do about it? Hannah flinched at the sharpness in his tone. I don't know, she admitted. I needed to talk to you. Barron's expression didn't change. You knew exactly what you were doing when you posted that video. She swallowed. Yeah, I did. And now that it's blowing back on your dad, you're having second thoughts? No, Hannah's voice was quiet but firm. I still think what he did was wrong. But he's my dad. Barron's gaze softened just slightly. There was the real reason she had texted him. Not because she wanted to undo what had been done, Not because she regretted it, but because she was scared. For the first time, Hannah looked vulnerable. Like she wasn't just a girl who had posted a viral video, but a daughter caught in a war she hadn't meant to start. "He won't talk to me," she admitted. "He just locks himself in his office. I don't know if I made things better or worse." Barron sighed, shifting his weight. "You didn't create this, Hannah. Your dad did. He made a choice." Hannah let out a shaky breath. "I know, but it doesn't make this any easier." Barron glanced away, watching the Spanish moss sway gently in the breeze. "Actions have consequences. For all of us." Hannah nodded slowly, staring down at her hands. "Yeah, I guess they do." A silence stretched between them, the city breathing around them. Finally, she asked, "So what are you going to do?" Barron exhaled through his nose, considering his words. "I haven't decided yet." But he already knew. He wasn't going to fight this the way people expected him to. He wasn't going to get into a shouting match on the news or let this moment turn into just another internet war. No, he was going to do something bigger, something that mattered. Hannah watched him carefully, something flickering behind her eyes. "Whatever it is, I hope it's the right thing." Barron met her gaze. "Me too." Across town, in the dimly lit office of Oglethorpe's, Jim Calloway sat at his desk, scrolling through the chaos unfolding online. The comments, the news articles, the messages. His restaurant was in trouble. His entire reputation, decades of hard work, was unraveling before his eyes. The door creaked open. Jim didn't look up. "Not now, Hannah." But it wasn't Hannah. Richard Carter stepped into the room, the smell of bourbon clinging to his tailored suit. "You know," he mused, pouring himself a drink from the bar in the corner, "I've seen a lot of men ruin themselves over pride." Jim clenched his jaw. "What do you want, Richard?" Richard took a slow sip, watching him over the rim of his glass. "To see if you finally figured out what this is going to cost you." Jim's fingers curled against the desk. "I'm not backing down." Richard let out a soft chuckle. "No, I didn't think you would." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "But I'll tell you this. Pride is the most expensive thing a man can own. And right now, you're about to pay for it in blood." Jim's throat felt dry. Richard finished his drink, setting the glass down with a sharp clink against the mahogany. "Your choice, Jim. But don't say I didn't warn you." He turned and walked out, leaving Jim alone with nothing but the blue light of his computer screen and the hollow weight in his chest. In Forsyth Park, Barron sat alone, scrolling through the endless wave of outrage and noise flooding his phone. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone wanted him to fight. But that wasn't the answer. He wasn't going to waste his time throwing words into a void. He was going to do something real, something that would change the conversation. For good. The city of Savannah woke up to chaos. By morning, the controversy surrounding Oglethorpe's had spilled beyond social media. News stations ran headlines dissecting every angle. Talk show hosts debated whether private businesses had the right to enforce neutrality. Radio stations fueled the fire, callers voicing everything from outrage to unwavering support. And Barron Trump's silence only made it worse. The world was waiting for him to react, to retaliate, to fight. But he wasn't interested in feeding a war. He was about to change the conversation. Barron sat at the edge of his bed, the soft morning light filtering through the curtains. His phone lay next to him, vibrating with unread messages. He ignored them. Instead, he picked up a worn leather notebook, flipping it open to a blank page. He let out a slow breath, then wrote 3 words at the top: bridging the divide. His plan was taking shape. And if he did this right, it wouldn't just be a response, it would be a statement. His phone buzzed again. "Hannah." He hesitated before answering. "Yeah, you're everywhere." Her voice was quiet, uncertain. "Every news station, every article. People are waiting for you to speak." "I know." A beat of silence. "And you're still not going to?" Barron leaned back against the headboard, staring at the ceiling. "Not in the way they expect." Hannah let out a breath. "What does that mean?" "You'll see." She hesitated. "I don't think my dad's going to bend on this, Barron. He's too proud. I don't need him to bend." Barron's voice was calm, steady. "I need him to see." Another pause. Then softer, "What are you planning?" Barron glanced at his notebook. Something better. Oglethorpe's wasn't the same that morning. The air inside the restaurant was thick, suffocating. The usual elegance, the crisp table linens, the gleaming silverware, the soft hum of classical music felt like a thin veil over something broken. Jim Calloway sat in his office, elbows on his desk, eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night. His phone had been ringing nonstop, messages pouring in, reporters demanding statements. He hadn't answered any of them, because for the first time in years, he wasn't sure what to say. A sharp knock on his office door made him flinch. "Not now," he muttered. The door opened anyway. Richard Carter stepped inside, his suit impeccable as always, his expression unreadable. "You look like hell." Jim let out a dry laugh. "That obvious?" Richard took a seat across from him, resting his hands on the armrests. "It's getting worse, Jim. You know that, right?" Jim exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "I know. You need to get ahead of this." "And do what? Apologize? Crawl back?" His voice was sharp, edged with frustration. "I made a decision. I stand by it." Richard studied him for a long moment. "You sure about that?" Jim looked away. "I don't regret enforcing the rules." His jaw tightened. "I regret this." He gestured vaguely at his phone, the storm raging beyond these four walls. "I never wanted this to turn into some damn culture war." "Well," Richard said, leaning forward, "it did." Jim didn't respond. Richard exhaled, shaking his head. "This is your last chance to turn it around, Jim. The choice is yours." Jim's stomach twisted because deep down he already knew this wasn't just about his restaurant anymore. It was about who he was becoming. The sun was high by the time Barron arrived at Forsyth Park. The sprawling green space was quiet, the occasional jogger passing by, the fountain glistening under the afternoon light. He sat on the same bench as the night before, notebook in hand. This was where it happened. He could already see it, the event, the people, the impact. A movement to shift the focus from outrage to action. He tapped his phone, scrolling through his contacts. Then he started making calls. First, to community leaders, then to local charities, then to organizers who knew how to turn a single idea into something tangible. His name had power. He was going to use it for something that mattered. Within hours, the wheels were in motion. By the end of the day, Savannah would know what was coming. Jim stood by the window of his office, watching as his staff moved about the restaurant, pretending everything was fine. It wasn't. A knock at the door made him turn. "Hannah." She stepped inside hesitantly, arms crossed. "You should see this." Jim frowned. "What now?" Wordlessly, she held up her phone. Jim stepped closer, and then he saw it. Barron Trump's face on the screen. A new headline. "Bridging the Divide. Barron Trump announces community fundraiser in Forsyth Park." Jim's stomach dropped. The article went on to describe a charity event, a gathering to promote dialogue, understanding, and support for underserved communities. Not a protest, not retaliation, a statement. Jim's fingers clenched at his sides. He had expected Barron to fight back, to go on television and condemn Oglethorpe's, to turn this into an all-out war. But instead, he had done the opposite. Hannah watched him carefully. People were talking about it. A lot of people. Jim forced himself to look away. "It's a PR stunt." "Is it?" Her voice was quiet. He didn't answer, because for the first time, Jim wasn't sure if he believed his own words. That night, the streets of Savannah buzzed with anticipation. News stations reported on Barron's upcoming event. Conversations shifted. It was no longer about what had happened inside Oglethorpe's. It was about what was coming next. And for the first time since this all began, Jim Calloway wasn't sure if he was still in control of the narrative.